Welcome back to another edition of Components Breakdown. Today we're going to look at the 2010 release game called Labyrinth. Now, I hope that everybody stayed with me through that 2+ minute video montage that I put together for everybody. The reason why I did that on a game like this is because it's a very extensive and robust game, and I wanted to make sure that most of the gameplay mechanics and all the components came through in something nice and quick, so I didn't have to go through a large portion of this video explaining everything in a lot more detail. What I'm not going to do here is go through a turn-by-turn or step-by-step basis on how a turn works. But what I want to do is give everybody a basic idea of how the gameplay works from one round to the next, and what the overall objectives are for each of these two very different sides in the game. Now, most people are going to compare this to a game like 1960 or Twilight Struggle, which both of them have some correlating gameplay mechanics that are used between both of the styles of games. However, it does differentiate itself in enough good areas to really make this one stand on its own 2 feet. Before I get started, though, I wanted to make sure that everybody understands that this is a game that has some very disturbing subject matter. And for those that don't want to listen, you can go ahead and turn off the video, and I apologize. I don't mean to offend anybody by doing a video on this style of game. I did it for the fact that the subject matter interests me and the gameplay mechanics really interest me. And I had some trouble with my own self trying to decide whether or not this is something I wanted to pursue. However, I will take it with the utmost care so that I do not offend anybody in doing this kind of video. There are a couple things that I wanted to mention prior to getting into the gameplay mechanics, and those consist of both the playbook and the player aids that come with the game. Now, I notoriously have said in some of my other video components breakdowns that I've had difficulty reading GMT rule sets for the fact that, number one, they're very dry and very boring and don't have a lot of examples in them, or enough examples to really give you a good idea of how a game plays from one round to the next. Now, what they've done in Labyrinth is they've done some really nice things. They've done a playbook. Now, I know this was also in Washington's War, but they've gone into a couple more rounds in this playbook that tell you how to set up a game. They walk you through each individual turn. I believe there's probably about 10 different turns in here, or plays of cards in here, that allow you to really understand all the gameplay mechanics. Now, I started reading the rule book initially and got to probably the 13th or 14th page and was like, oh goodness, here we go again. So I decided just to go ahead and read this and play it through here, and they give a lot of references to go to certain parts in the rule book. No problems at all. This was a huge adjustment for me. So I would suggest anybody that's interested in this game, read this first. And whenever it references something in here, go ahead and go to the rules, but come back to this. It's going to give you a real good understanding of the flow of the game, and that is so important when you start reading GMT rule sets. The second thing are these two very large 11x17 fold-out player aids. There is one for each of the sides. As you see, there's a U.S. operations and a jihadist operations. They give you all of the basic ops and options and actions that you can take for each of the two sides. It is wonderfully written, and it is essential to be able to play this game. Again, keep this next to you when you're using the playbook. Reference it as many times as you can. This is one of the easier games that I have been able to understand from the GMT rules. It is night and day from Washington's War for me, and night and day from Twilight Struggle. Both other games that I really enjoy now and love. So note that. Go ahead and read that first, use your player aids, and I think you'll have a much better experience in learning this game. So let's move on. To understand Labyrinth is basically to understand how a card-driven system game is played. For those that are familiar with 1960 and Twilight Struggle, this is going to be a very easy portion of the game to understand. For those that are unfamiliar, please just bear with me as I try to explain it to each of you. Now, the game ships with 120 cards, and each of these cards can be used by each of the players in two different ways, either as operational values or as events. Looking at the cards, they have an operation value at the top, starting with a 3 in the Libyan WMD to 2 and finally 1 to the one on the right. Those are the number of operational things they can do in a specific turn. They always value from 1 to 3 through all the cards in the deck. However, below that and below the picture are events that they can use that same card for. So they can either use it as one or the other. Also, all cards have an alignment or a faction that they belong to. The one on the left belongs to the U.S., the one in the middle is neutral, and the one on the right belongs to the jihadist funding or the Islamic or Islamist-ruled nations. Now, players will always have an opportunity to play one or the other, depending upon which one they wish to use. However, if that particular card belongs to the other faction, so say if I'm playing as the Islamist player and I play this card for the operational value, the U.S. player could also use this same card for the event, enacting whatever it is, as long as they meet the conditions at the bottom of the card. That's how the game plays out from one round to the next. But unlike those other two games that I mentioned, where you're only playing one card before your opponent does, in Labyrinth, it's really unique for the fact that you're allowed to play two cards in a row, allowing for players to have very nice combinations from one turn to the next. Basically what's going to happen is each player at the start of the game is going to decide on a scenario in which the war starts in a particular year. A scenario simply states how the starting board takes place, which nations are neutral, allies, or adversaries, how many troops start on the board, and so forth. Players are also going to decide on how many rounds they're going to play or how many times through the deck. A short game is going through the large deck just once. A medium game is twice, and a long game 3 times, which is going to take every bit of 3 or 4 hours to go through. What's going to happen is on each player's turn, they're going to play 2 cards and decide if they want to use those cards in their hand either for operational uses or for the event. Very easy to understand. So let's explain how that works. The objective of the game is for each of the 2 factions, or one of the 2 factions, to meet one of their 3 victory conditions. Anytime any of those victory conditions are met, they will immediately win the game. And I won't go into what those are, but they're quite different from one another, although they do have some underlying principles that are similar to one another. Now, the whole objective of the game is to try to control as many regions as you can and change their governance over to your side. What does that mean exactly? Well, the board is broken into 3 different kinds of countries. And I'm going to zoom into this particular area right here that has Israel, Jordan, and Iraq, which are the 3 different types of areas in the game. Israel, much like the rest of Europe, are non-Muslim states. They simply have a posturing. They don't have any kind of neutrality to them or governance levels. All they do is allow players to signify what that country's posture is towards terrorism, either soft or hard, which is basically an overlying look of how the world looks at particular actions that are taking place on the board. If you're going to deploy troops, how do the countries feel about it? If you're going to wage a jihad, how will the countries feel about it? And that's going to fluctuate as the game progresses. The 2 states right here, Jordan and Iraq, are both Muslim states, represented by the white and the green symbols here. One is for the Sunni, and one is for the Shiite. Now, those don't have any game-bearing mechanics to them other than what cards may be introduced into the game. What's very important, though, are the numbering systems, or these little markers that you see here. I'm going to zoom in over here to show you what all 4 of them look like. Starting on left to right, that goes 1 for good, 2 for fair, 3 for poor, and 4 for Islamist rule. If you're the U.S. player, you want to have as many countries as you can in the good faction as allies. If you're the Islamist rule or the jihadist player, you want to have as many countries in the Islamist rule. So they fluctuate from left to right as you see here. When a game starts, certain countries are going to start in certain areas. You have Saudi Arabia here, which for instance is an ally but a very poor ally to the U.S. And you have Pakistan, which is a neutral country but fair, pretty good. And you have Afghanistan, obviously, with an Islamist rule and is an adversary to the U.S. You have little markers in the game which represent terrorist or sleeper cells. Terror cells, the upside means they're sleeping. The active side, which is that little symbol there, means they are active, which allow them to take actions at certain areas and do specific things. You have troops here for the U.S., which again allow them to take actions and do specific things. There are prestige levels, which the U.S. player will be using to enact certain war of ideas on the board and allow them to change governance levels. So there's a lot going on in this game, and basically, to give you a real quick overview of how it works, is players are going to be playing cards from one round to the next, either doing a war of ideas, disrupting operations, alerting states or countries about terrorist plots, maybe deploying troops, doing regime changes in areas. And on the jihadist side, they're going to be, of course, committing jihad or terrorist acts, traveling to areas, plotting, and recruiting sleeper cells throughout the board. It's a very in-depth game and something that I can't even remotely do it justice in discussing. What I wanted to give everybody a basic idea, though, is how this game differentiates itself from the other 2 games that I previously mentioned. One is the fact that it uses 2 cards per round, and the other is the fact that it has some really cool governance levels in here, changing ideas. If you go too hard with troops, you're going to hurt yourself with your ability to react to other areas. It's a wonderfully well thought out, probably one of my favorite games of 2010. I would rate it just above Twilight Struggle for the reason that, for me personally, it hits more to home. It's something I'm a lot more familiar with. I think that the mechanics work wonderfully well. I think that the 2 different factions, although I didn't get into them too much about how they work completely different. Their abilities to use operations are completely different. The Jihadist really relies on dice to do their operations, while the American player relies on the cards that they have, either a 1, 2, 3 or operational cards depending upon the governance level, which I didn't get into, but there's a lot of stuff in this game, and it's very well written. The rulebook is well written, the playbook is well written, and the player aids are priceless. This is one of my favorite games of 2010. I would suggest that anybody who is in wargaming at all, anyone who's into GMT games, and if you're a huge admirer of Twilight Struggle, pick up this game. I do not think you'll be disappointed. That is Labyrinth, and I am Jeremy Salinas. Thank you very much for watching.